Now, for the world's legion of football fans, the countdown to the World Cup in Qatar is now officially underway. The draw for the group stage has been taking place in the Qatari capital, Doha. 29 of the 32 places have been filled. There are 8 groups for the first round, each containing 4 teams. The hosts, Qatar, face African champions Senegal, the Netherlands and Ecuador in their maiden tournament. England will be up against the USA, Iran, and one of Wales, Scotland, or Ukraine. Other big matchups include Spain and Germany in Group E, and Belgium against Croatia in Group F, while Ghana will have a grudge match against Uruguay, who controversially knocked them out of the 2010 tournament. The World Cup runs from November 21st to December 18th at 8 venues. Well, as well as being a business reporter, Laurie Laird is also a big follower of all things football, and she joins me now. Good to see you.
And Charles, you can't argue that football is also big business. These two things do overlap.
I absolutely agree, which is why you probably wear the same hats when you're talking about
absolutely.
both of them.
One and the same.
But interestingly, Nigeria not in that, but a lot of other lucky groups will be taking part. What do you make of it?
And it was bizarre to see this draw without Nigeria there. And Senegal, the top-ranked African team, probably has a reasonable chance. So if we start off with Africa, probably has a reasonable chance of making it to the knockout stage. They got pretty lucky in the draw. They're drawn with Qatar, which is one of the first out of the gate, but Qatar is going to have a very, very difficult route if they want to make much of that home team advantage. But in that top group, we've got Qatar, Ecuador, Senegal, and Holland. And it looks very likely, if these teams play according to form, that we'll see Holland and Senegal go through. Now, the rest of the African teams, Ghana, Tunisia, Morocco, and Cameroon, much more difficult route. And you mentioned in your lead up Cameroon and Uruguay in that grudge match. It will be difficult for Ghana to, I said Cameroon, I meant Ghana and Uruguay in that grudge match. Ghana, now ranked about 60th in FIFA rankings, will be very, very difficult for them to win any matches in their group.
And broadly speaking, I mean, for Africa, there's always a lot of hope leading up to the World Cup. But I mean, historically, none of the teams have ever gone beyond the quarterfinals.
And it feels like with every tournament, we are seeing ever more African players play at the very top level of the Premier League, and we think that means that these African countries are coming up. But Senegal, I think, will be everybody's team to watch, ranked 20th in the FIFA rankings, and again, very easy route to the knockout stage, so keep an eye on them.
And this World Cup tournament, the first to be held in the Middle East, would it be fair to say that Qatar is arguably the most controversial host in the history of the World Cup?
Let's go out on a limb and say that, Charles. So, for many reasons, Qatar's human rights record, but I think initially what people looked at is it's 50 degrees there. How on earth do you play a tournament of such athletic intensity in such conditions? And that's why the tournament is taking place a lot later, running between November and December, and it will feel very odd in a World Cup year not to be watching these matches in the height of the European summer. But when we get back to this group stages, Charles, the one that's really striking is Group B. That's England. England probably will go through, but let's go through.
You called it the political.
It was. We're often talking about the group of death when we look at these draws, and that's the group with the most highly concentrated, high-ranked teams. But this one really stuck out. England, America, Iran, and then one of 3 teams. There are a couple of games to go, either Wales, Scotland, or Ukraine. So it'll be a fascinating bit
So
to
England
watch.
is going to play Iran.
And on day 1, second game of the tournament, England will play Iran, and we see and America will play one of the 3 that I just mentioned, and we'll go back to that in a little bit because it does involve Ukraine, and then we'll see where we go from there. For England fans, they'll be very pleased. It's an easy route to the knockout stage for England.
Well, tell us about Ukraine.
Fascinating area here. Ukraine was meant to play Scotland not long ago to see which of those 2 teams would go ahead to a playoff. That the winner of that event would play Wales, and then the winner of that one goes in and would sit in this Group B. The Scotland-Ukraine game has been scheduled for some time in June, but the Scottish coach has said, we don't know if it'll be played or not. There are so many uncertainties, but as and when that game is played, the winner of that will play Wales, and that will be the 4th team in the political group of death.
Okay, we've got less than a minute or so. Is everything ready to go? All the infrastructure in Qatar up and running?
From what we hear, the eight venues are ready to go. This draw took place in Qatar. It looked like everything was done and ready to go. I think the big question will be the temperature. Qatar has made a lot of promises about moderate temperatures, making it easier for Europeans in particular to play in very, very an unusual climate. I think we won't really know whether that's worked until we get there in November.
We've got about 20 seconds or so. Who have you got your money on then?
I've got to say Senegal, don't you? But I think England is one to watch. We talked about Germany, or we didn't, we mentioned in the lead up, Germany and Spain in one of the groups. That's a matchup people will be watching, but Germany's really faltered lately. They'll have a tough time in that group.
Laurie, thank you very much indeed. I'm actually hugely impressed there with your knowledge of sort of football. But stay with us because, I mean, the one that I'm sure about, business, is up next, and we'll be talking to Laurie again about Russian gas exports and Putin's threats to turn off the taps. That's after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Arise News Hour. I'm Charles Anyagolu in London. Business news now. And Russian gas has continued to flow to Europe despite Russian President Vladimir Putin's threat to cut off supplies to customers who refuse to pay in rubles. Meanwhile, the effects of the war in Ukraine are filtering through to Western economies. Arise correspondent Laurie Laird is still with me to discuss the day's business news. Thank you for staying with us. Is it rather strange and a curious economic dimension to this conflict that Russia is still providing oil and gas to countries that are sanctioning it over its invasion of Ukraine?
Well, it just shows you what Russia has to do to raise some funds. And this is what gas provides: two things for Russia. In the immediate future, it gives them some degree of income to continue to finance this war and anything else Russia may choose to finance after that. But most of the fresh money coming into the exchequer in Russia is going straight back out to fight this thing. How long that will be the case is an open question. It also gives Vladimir Putin, the president, some leverage. He can continue, and I think he will continue to toy with this. He will continue to say, come along my way, or I will cut off this gas. And as brave as some of the European countries, Germany and Italy, have tried to be, at least with their rhetoric, saying, we're going to wean ourselves off of this stuff, they can't do it right now. They are simply too dependent on Russian gas. The transition away from it is far too immature to be able to contemplate that.
Briefly, why would President Putin want to be paid in Russian rubles? I would have thought he'd be more interested in getting foreign exchange.
Well, the more rubles that come in, look, for these companies to buy rubles to pay for these gas shipments, they've got to sell something. So if they sell euros or sell dollars to buy rubles, the price of the ruble goes up, demand for rubles goes up, that increases its price, the price of dollars, euros goes down.
Right. So it's a way of propping up the ruble.
It's helpful. I think he's using it more as leverage, but a bit of a lift for the ruble won't hurt.
Meanwhile, the Eurozone inflation has hit another record high of 7.5%.
Absolutely, and we have been hitting record highs over the past couple of months, but the reason that this number is so important, Charles, is it's one of the first numbers from a developed country that we've seen that takes place that actually gives us a sense of what happened in the month of March after the invasion happened. A lot of economic data is lagged, and when you're at an inflection point like this, it doesn't give us a whole lot of information. These are March data. This is a massive rise in inflation from 5.8% in February. You don't tend to see that kind of a step up in an inflation number like this. Almost all of it was energy. Energy prices up 44%, also a record high over the year, and that's why CPI went up so very high. Really surprised the European Union. You've surprised the European Central Bank, and very, very hurriedly they got the chief economist of the European Central Bank, put him on international television to try and get him to calm things down. And I'm not going to lie here, Charles, he didn't do a particularly good job of it.
Let's go to the United States, a country you're well familiar with. A strong jobs report just out, and the African American jobless rate down to 6.2% from 6.6%. How significant is that?
It is a big fall in the unemployment rate, no doubt about that, Charles, but it's not quite as good as that headline number would give you. The African American participation rate actually went down, so that means a large chunk of African Americans left the workforce. So the reason that the unemployment rate came down is that fewer people were actually looking for a job. So you've got to look at how many people, you've got to look at both sides of that fraction. You've got to look at the numerator and the denominator. The denominator came down a little bit, fewer people looking for jobs, so that's why the unemployment rate came down. It is still most welcome, but we're nowhere near that 5.1, 5.2% jobless rate for African Americans that we saw in late 2019, ironically, under President Trump.
What about other parts of that jobs report?
A pretty good report, Charles, up about 441,000. That was in line with expectations. The unemployment rate came down to 3.6%, which is very low by international standards. The European Union unemployment rate at a record low at 6.8%. So that gives you a little bit of perspective there. But we're still a little bit above where we were pre-pandemic. And again, let's look at this participation rate again, much, much higher than it was pre-pandemic. And that seems to suggest that people who may have lost their job during the pandemic have said, I'm not going back. Looks to be concentrated in older people. People may have retired early, but we still don't have a full set of data to understand exactly why participation has fallen and is not recovering.
Well, let's come back to the UK here where we are, and that nettlesome cost of living crisis.
And this in the London today, in the UK today, Charles, has been the story of the day. It is leading every newscast here. It is more severe here than in other developed nations, and a lot of the reason is that gas prices, which have risen so much over the past year, accelerated over the past couple of months, they're regulated here. So you and I have a cap on what we can pay for the gas to heat our homes. That cap was raised by 53%. The announcement a couple of months ago, that came into effect today. So that cost of living that many developed and developing nations are facing, that big rise, more acute right now in the UK.
And it may not get better because, I mean, beyond the UK, you talked about Europe and other parts of the world. The WTO saying the war in Ukraine will significantly affect global trade this year. Tell us more.
The WTO has been warning about this. Look, trade as a proportion of GDP had been falling anyway. Since Donald Trump came into office, we've seen a little bit more of a decoupling, a segregation of regions within the world with trade. A lot of countries have learned through the pandemic and now through the war in Ukraine that if you depend too much on one supplier, you can really have some difficulty. So there's a lot of talk, not so much investments yet, but a lot of talk about decoupling, bringing production, bringing supply lines back onshore or near shore, and that will decrease the amount of international trade.
Laurie, thank you very much indeed. Laurie Laird, our business correspondent, and sometimes also a sports analyst.